Hey, good morning, everyone. This is Travis McGrath from the Exago Services team, and I'm very happy to provide today's Exago Support Lab. We're going to be focusing on a brand new feature in our 20.1 version called storage management. Like always, I see a lot of familiar faces in the GoToWebinar here. Everyone's on mute, but if you could put a yes, a hello, something to indicate that you guys can hear me and see my screen. You should see the mouse moving and the opening intro slide here. Awesome, lots of yeses, very excited. Part of the reason I'm so excited is this is a new feature in our release that just came out at the beginning of this month, version 20.1, and this is the major new. It's an overhaul to an existing part of our application and platform, and because it's an overhaul, we're actually going to be doing this as a 4-part series. So we're doing a lab today, another lab on Thursday, and then 2 more next week where we can do deep dives on individual aspects of this feature. So today we're really just going to be laying a groundwork, getting some key terminology and a basic understanding, and then we're going to be doing a deep dive on 3 of the sort of sub features here over the next 2 weeks. As always, at any point, if you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to type them into the chat just where you gave a yes and a hello. I've got my colleagues Emma and Tom in the chat who are going to be helping answer questions. And Emma's actually going to be presenting Thursday's lab on migration, so she'll be very familiar with the content here as well. Awesome. So to kick us off, just an agenda for today. We're going to be going through some key concepts of the new feature. In order to talk about what's new and how we overhauled the system, we're going to give a very quick overview of how the storage management or folder management system worked in past versions of Exago. Then we're going to be going into detail about how those key concepts are implemented and do a brief showing of the system itself and how to set up and configure it if you're getting started. And of course, we're going to end with a Q&A so we can answer many questions that are certain to arise here. Awesome. So first of all, what is storage management? Let's dive into those key concepts. And we'll start with the really simple definition. This is an overhaul to how reports and folders are, the definitions of those reports and folders are saved. That doesn't give you a whole lot to go on. So let's get a little more detailed. And what we want to do here is look at saving the report definitions into a database. We'll talk about how that was done previously in past versions, but here we're going to do it for anyone using Exago, all of our clients. We're going to save them into a database. And this is going to provide a couple of benefits. Namely, we're going to use IDs to identify a report instead of the path of a report. And this is about making sure the system is robust. So if you have a linked report or a dashboard or a chained report, and you need to reference that, it's using an advanced report or something to open a link or to showcase on a dashboard, you don't want to worry about whether somebody changes the folder name that the thing you're referencing it lives inside of. By using unique IDs, everything is going to be really robustly identified. Additionally, by using a database, we're going to have more nuanced permissioning. So not just can you see everything in a folder, but maybe do you want to see individual things? Do you want to sort things out of order? Do you want to have more fine-grained permissions about what a user can do with the reports that they have access to and who has access to the reports? We're now going to have some more sophisticated settings and features available here. Finally, as part of this overhaul, with our, always improving performance, we found places where we can do caching and reduce the number of times we need to load definitions. And we've separated some pieces of the definition into their own columns in the database. We're going to look at the structure of those, that storage in just a bit, but we've reduced the number of times we're loading definitions and improved sort of how we're storing things in terms of performance. And then finally, and this is a big one here, is this eliminates the need for customization. In 19.2 and all the previous versions, we had many clients who already wanted to use a database to store their report definitions. And in order to do so, they implemented folder management. If you're a regular to our series, you've seen our folder management support lab in the past. And that is a great feature, but to accomplish something that you sort of just want to have work, it required implementing this customization and maintaining sort of a separate piece of code. Even if we just use the out-of-box example or off of our support site, it still required that customization setup, and this eliminates that need. Awesome. So I'm just going to pause there briefly and scan through the questions. I see a lot of positive notes there from that definition, so we'll keep going here. So key terms. We're going to use the word content to mean report, folder, theme, or document template. Throughout this presentation, I'm likely just going to say report, but in almost every case that I do so, we're going to mean any of these four things. Access is to say who can see a piece of content and what they can do with it. An owner, there's going to be a new concept here called owners. So when a piece of content is created, be it a folder or a report, you can specify who the owner is. And if you're the owner of something, it means you always should have access to it. You should always be able to see it and have full permissions to edit, rename, delete it because you own it. And then finally, we're going to use the word party. And we're going to use the word party not to mean, fiesta or celebration, but the way a lawyer would use it. So we're talking about a level of user or group of users. So think of a party could be an individual, a party could mean a department, a company, a region, or even everyone. Like there could be a party level that means everyone should have access to this, and that's what we mean when we say party. And we're going to see that come into play in just a minute. Great question came up. I was referencing IDs just a moment ago, and there's a couple of questions have come in about how linked reports or dashboards, how existing content will be migrated, and that's actually going to be one of our Q&As at the end. But I'll say for now, we're going to leave the conversation around migration to Thursday's lab, where we can talk through that in detail here. Awesome. So speaking of migration, let's talk about how things worked before. So how are reports and content saved and stored previously? And Exago provided three options. So our default system was to use the file system, was to save report definitions as WR files or WRT files or WRD files on the file system in a report path. And that was great. We also offered the folder management feature, which many clients took advantage of, that allowed for customization. We have a example off of our support site that could be used basically out of plug and play to store the report definitions into a database. And we had a cloud interface. And those three systems worked for the most part, but we wanted to get some of those benefits and get over some limitations. So the file system, we had the limitation of having everything on the file system on the server, on a single server, and having to use those report paths to find things. The folder management setup required either custom coding or at the very least maintenance and updating from our support site example. And the cloud interface had some performance implications that we wanted to do better with. So with that in mind, these were the big onus to overhaul the system to what it is now in 20.1. Awesome. So speaking of now, how does it work? So first of all, if we're storing things into a database, we should start there. So let's look at how the database, what we support. So we're going to support MS SQL, MySQL, Oracle, Postgres, and SQLite. SQLite is a file-based system, so it's really not recommended for production, but we support it if you want to use it in a dev or a staging environment to quickly spin up an environment for testing with the new version. It's really helpful in that regard. There are a couple of other database types that we support, but these are our official list here. Okay, so now that we know what kinds of databases we're working in, let's look at some key tables. And there are going to be three key tables in our our implementation here. So the content table, as you might guess, that's where we're going to store the report definitions, the folder definitions, all the content. A content access table, so we're going to keep track of, for each piece of content, which party or user should have access to it. And then party type. So being that different implementations of Exago are going to have different types of users, different levels of users. The party types aren't statically defined in Exago. They're going to be drawn from a database so that they can be structured to match your particular permissioning and needs. And that's it. We're just going to have those 3 tables here. And of course, if we're talking about tables in a database, we can look at an ER diagram, and it's a pretty simple one. So we have our content table. And the key thing here, of course, is a content ID. So this is a GUID, a guaranteed unique ID, as well as the content itself. So the text content, these are the XML definitions, the names, the types of contents. And then once you have the basics of what the content and the definition itself contain, we have some, what you might think of as metadata: who created it, when it was last modified and by whom, who the owner is, and some other things that help, as I said, with those performance optimizations, keeping track of which export types are allowed, the description, keeping those in their own separate columns helps for performance purposes as we load the Exago interface or individual reports. The content access table gives a say over who has access to each piece of content. And what it does is it says for a piece of content, it joins the content ID. It also says which parent ID, that is to say which folder or if it's residing in the root. And then it uses the party type and a party ID to specify which party this should apply to. And so the key here is that you may say, for the user level and this individual user. So that would be, this content record is going to say this is a user level record, specifying the party type. And then the party ID might say this is Travis, or this is Emma, or this is, whoever it might be here. And then additionally, the content access can specify some permissioning, that is to say the sort order. So if you want to have things appear in non-alphabetic, you may have a My Reports folder or a standard reports library that you want to have at the top of the folder structure, as well as these access flags. And we're going to dive into access flags in next Tuesday's lab about permissioning, but the access flags are what are going to specify what you can do with the piece of content once you see it here. So that is to say, is it read-only? Can I edit it? Can I delete it? Can I rename it? Those sorts of things. And then the party type, as I said, is just defining which levels of users you want to have permissions for. So these are individual users, companies, classes of users, everyone, that sort of thing. And those will be populated a couple by default, but this is something you can change to meet your specific permissioning needs here. Okay, a couple questions came in, so I'm just going to pause very briefly here. A question came in about logging. One of my colleagues can answer that one separately because it's something that can be done but isn't going to be pertinent here. Yeah, and then another question came in about migration. And again, we're going to cover migration in great detail in Thursday's lab. So when we want to talk about how to move existing content that you already have built from previous versions of Exago into this structure, we're going to showcase how to do that step by step on Thursday's lab with Emma. Awesome. So then the other thing here to specify is, we have our database structure and tables in place, and I'm going to show how to set these up in just a moment. But the other thing you have to do, of course, is tell Exago when being launched which user or which party is using Exago so that we know how to permission which reports and folders and content they have access to. So what I'm going to do is just showcase there's a new property in both the .NET and the REST API. So in the .NET object, there's a new storage management configuration property, and there's a method called set identity. So you can set the party type as well as the value of that particular party type for a particular session. So in this case, you would imagine this is saying the user ID is equal to Travis. And if I'm logging in and creating content, I also want to be the owner of that content, so the owner ID as well. And then the REST API, we have a storage management endpoint, so we can make a REST call, and patch that for this particular session. Again, setting those identity properties to specify who the user and who the owner are. One important note, so this is a key part of both migration. So Emma will probably reiterate this again on Thursday, but while making these API changes are important, these don't replace setting the user ID and company ID parameter values that are used by features like the scheduler and other extensibility features. So setting these values is an important part of upgrading to 20.1, but shouldn't replace setting the user ID and company ID parameters. It should just be done in addition to as well. Okay, so finally, how do we do it? What's the setup and configuration look like here? So for the setup, we're going to break it into just a couple of parts. So we're going to go into the admin console, and you have to specify where the database is. Exago needs to know, what database to use. We're going to build those tables so that they exist, and we can use them to store the reports and permissions. We're going to set the owner identity and the owner ID and the user identities through the API, and we just looked at the sort of quick 2 lines of code up above on how to do that. And then Exago really handles the rest. So, from there, when a user creates a report, you don't have to do a lot of additional work or customization. The storage, the retrieval will be handled there. Okay, so now it's time to see it. So let's dive into it. And what we're going to do is start with the admin console, and I'm just going to give it a quick refresh here. And in our 20.1 admin console, what you'll notice is that we've pulled the report path out of the main settings. And instead, we're using storage management settings. So we separated these into its own section up at the very top. And here, the storage management is looking for a particular assembly. Now, we haven't talked a lot about customization. There is still a customization option because that's a design principle and real core philosophy of Exago to always offer extensibility and customization where we can and where we think it's going to be useful. So we're going to talk about that next week in the last part of the series on customization. But for now, if you're using this without making custom changes, you won't have to modify these at all, but they're here if you do. But we're going to use the sort of provided DLL right out of the box. We're going to specify the type of database. Again, we mentioned which databases were supported here, the provider, and I've got a dummy connection string here just for my demos, but the connection string for the database. And now, if you're a DBA, you may say, hey, I don't want you choosing the name of the database tables yourself, and that's great. So we can append a prefix here if we want. Once we've got everything in place, we can check the database settings, make sure we're successful connecting, and we can see what we need. We can see what SQL will be used to generate, or in my case, I already have these tables, so we're just doing an update. But you can see the SQL that's going to be written before we send anything to the database. And then from there, if we want, it can build the database just by hitting prepare database. And then it can also add all of the themes that come with Exago in the themes folder for styling, crosstabs, and express views and things like that. We can add those themes and load them into the database with just the click of a button here. Okay, great. So then the other part here is pulling from the database, we have the various identity properties. In this case, I have a user ID, a company ID, and a class ID. Think of this as like a department within a company. And so I've set some default values here, but like all the other settings in the admin console, these are meant to be changed through the API. So here we have a sort of the default values, but of course we already showed the .NET and the REST endpoint to change these and set them to the session specific values. That's a really important part of this upgrade process. From there, we have just a few more settings in the admin console. We do have a concept now of inheritance. So we can set an inherit flag if you want to have a piece of content when it's saved into a folder. If inherit is true, what will happen is that piece of content will gain all the same access records and permissions that the folder had as well. So if you have a folder that maybe has multiple pieces of content access, specifying different users or different companies have access to it, you can set inherit to true, and when a new folder or report is saved into that existing parent folder, it will gain all those same permissions. In my case, I have this set to false. I actually don't, just for my own purpose, I just wanted to not use that. And what I can do is say, when you save a new piece of content, here's the user access permission, or the content access permission I want, in this case, user. And here's the level of access I want you to give. So in this case, I'm saying save it specific to me, the user, and give me full access. But we could have it saved to everyone at, in this case, Exago, or everyone on the services team, or everyone period, and you can choose which level of access you want to create here. And again, we're going to talk in a lot more detail about permissioning in our upcoming lab. And then finally, we have some cache settings. So we can cache both the list of reports as well as individual report definitions. And setting these to true just helps with performance. You can set timeouts on the cache, but also if a user saves a report definition or adds a new report, it's going to invalidate and reload that cache so that the user sees the new report they just created. But enabling these helps reduce the number of times we have to load the report list or individual report definitions. Awesome. So I'm just going to pause there and see if there are any questions on the admin settings so far. Great question came in. Is there a plan to add a UI for managing which users have access to which reports or individual folders? So there are a couple of neat things there. We're going to showcase, I believe, and Emma, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe you're going to showcase a utility. We're going to provide a desktop utility for reading the database and seeing who has access to which records. But also, yes, long-term on our roadmap is this overhaul is sort of a platform for future enhancements. So some of those features, including an interface to see, who has access to things, or even allow users to share reports and give access to other users, is on our long-term roadmap. And this is sort of a building block working towards that. And a couple more questions came in. Okay, looks like that's all the questions here. So we'll jump over. So once we have the admin settings in place, we've built and prepared the SQL, we've actually applied it and loaded it into the database. Then we can hop over. I'm just using a database visualizer here. We can see the ER diagram, but in this case, we can also look at individual content. So in the content table, this is where my report definitions are stored. You see everything is given a unique ID. We keep track of obviously the type, the name, the description, and then most importantly, of course, is the definition. So for reports, you're going to see an XML definition. For Express views, you're going to see a JSON array. For themes, you may just see a comma-separated list of colors. And then, of course, for document templates, we have those in a separate column of bit content. And then, as I mentioned before, we're going to have some metadata around who created reports, who's the owner, what exports are allowed, all those sorts of things. From there, as we mentioned, the other two tables are content access record. This is where we're saying for a particular piece of content, show which folder, or you'll see all these zeros. This means the root, where that resides. and who should have access to it. So in my case, 4 means an individual user. So you see I have access to this report. 1 means everyone has access to it. And then there's a number over here. This is an access flag. Again, specifying, is it read-only? Can we rename it? Can we move it? Those sorts of things. And we're going to dive into a lot more detail about that when we talk through permissioning. And then finally, the party type table. This is where you can specify what levels of users you want to have access records for, and what priority those take. So if an individual user record beats out a company or class user record, you can change the priority. So these are some sort of out-of-the-box defaults here, but being true to our design philosophy in Exago, you can modify and adjust these as you see fit. Awesome. And so then finally the front end, and this is actually sort of a trick statement here. In the front end, not a lot should have changed for the user. They still can just build reports and folders. They can still see all the content that they're expecting. The only major differences are that they'll see, if they're the owner of a report, they'll see an icon indicating, hey, you're the owner. So that if they move or delete something, they'll be aware that they're doing it as the owner, and it'll impact, it'll be deleted for everyone. And then the other thing here, of course, is they'll be able to see things if you choose to set them up, where you have maybe individual reports that are read-only but not the whole folder. There may be some content that you can rename or not. So for example, I don't have access to rename this particular folder. It's just not one of the permissions I have set up in this instance. But for the most part, from a user perspective, while this is an overhaul of how the behind the scenes storage works, it shouldn't have a lot of impact on the user other than being generally more performant and having a little more flexibility and some permissioning nuance that makes it more usable, things like ownership, as well as inheritance, things like that. Okay, great. So moving over to the last piece here, we have any questions. And while there have been a number in the chat so far that my colleagues have been fielding here, I do want to prompt a few beforehand. So one already came up, which was, what about existing reports? And that's a great question, and why on Thursday our lab is going to be specifically about migration. So why we're going to detail in all 3 cases for the file system, for using folder management, and for cloud, we're going to walk through. I think we may actually, for time's sake, only walk through the file system and folder management, but the cloud setup is going to be very similar. So we're going to showcase exactly how to walk through migration from the existing reports into the new content table and content access. Another question you might ask is, what about roles? Didn't they used to control who had access to which folders and which things were read-only? And the answer is absolutely. Roles still apply. If you want to, theoretically, you could stop using roles and do everything from the database, the content access record. But if you have roles already built into your system, they work just fine. You can continue using them, no problems there. The other 2 questions sort of fall into the same category. What if my database wasn't listed above? Or what if I want to do something different? I had a very customized version of folder management, or I want to continue using the file system, or I have my own way of doing permissioning on who has access to which reports that I want to apply instead. And that's where our last lab in this series, next Thursday, is going to come into play. We're going to talk about how to customize, how to use a different DLL in the settings I showed in the admin console. And instead of using the provided example for handling report storage, we'll have a off the support site example that you can see. We'll walk through it and we'll show how to customize it. In fact, one of my colleagues, Nick Cortina, is going to be doing that lab, and he's got a really cool example and use case for how you could do that and why you might want to, that he's going to showcase. So I want to preempt a couple of those questions here, and then I want to turn it over to you. So I'm just going to pause here and see which questions have either been asked that are very general and I can repeat them, or haven't yet been answered. Great question came in, which was, is there a way to have a report that is used on a dashboard or linked report, but not shown in the report tree? This is a feature that was not previously possible, but because of those new, more nuanced permissioning, the answer is actually yes. This is a new capability that's available because of this overhaul to folder storage management, excuse me. And so how that's going to work is you can create a report as the owner of the report, you can build it, you can see it, but you may want to only share or only make available a dashboard. But in order to execute that dashboard, a user has to have access to run certain reports that appear on the dashboard, or the same is true with linked reports. And because those access flags are more nuanced, and again, we're going to detail how this works specifically, but effectively there's this access flag column, and this is a bit sum. If you don't know what that is, we're going to go over it next Tuesday. Don't worry, we'll go into more detail. But effectively, there's a way to set this value where a report can be visible, can be executable, but not visible. So it won't appear in the main menu, but it will be something that can be run if it's already configured to be loaded on a linked report or on a dashboard. So that's a really cool new feature that's possible because of this. Another great question came in that said, is there a way to track reports or track changes to reports? What if you want to roll back a report, for example? Yes, because this is a database system, if you want to, either through the customization, we can talk about that on Thursday, or there's actually a way you can do this using database triggers. You could keep track of changes and even version histories. We didn't implement that out of the box because it sort of expands the storage and memory scope of the database, but it is something that is supported in this example, or in this with this overhaul. Our report executions logged and audited. For report executions, you can set up logging and auditing using the extensibility features that existed in both 19.2 and in 20.1, of course. Great question came in. What if you wanted to transfer ownership of a report or have multiple owners? So currently in the front-end interface, we're not going to have a direct UI for transferring ownership, but this is something, of course, using the database you can change. And the owner, while in my code examples up above in the presentation, was set just to be the user ID. I sort of think of, I built the report, therefore I should be the owner. You could set the owner ID to be something like everyone at this company shares ownership of something. So you could use a different party level or a different ID to indicate some sort of shared ownership. And then a great question came in about next week's labs. So as I mentioned a couple of times, this is a 4-part series. Here, we just wanted to give a quick 30-minute overview, but we're going to do a deep dive on Thursday about migration. On next Tuesday, we're going to talk in depth about permissioning, which is why I glanced over some details there, because I know we're going to go on a much deeper dive. And then following Thursday, we're going to talk through the customization feature and how it can be supported. And you should have already received invites to register for those webinars, but if not, we'll make sure to follow up with everyone who attended this one and make sure that you get invites to all of those for registration. And as always, these are all recorded and posted on our support site. So if ever you want to refer back to these, particularly the migration and permissioning labs, and use them as reference material, they're always available on our knowledge base, as are true with all of our support labs. Okay, I'll take a few more questions and then we'll close out here. It looks like my team, Emma and Tom, have been busy answering everyone's questions. So I don't see any coming in. So with that, I'll just reiterate, we're really excited about this new feature. It is a major change for all of our clients because everyone does have to migrate over to the system. So if you have any questions, if you haven't already been in contact with your CSM, or you ever need anything at all as you approach this upgrade, our updating guide these videos. We have a lot of built-in resources, written video content as well. But if you ever have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to both your CSM and of course services at Exago Inc. As we can help guide you through this upgrade. But we're really excited about this feature, and as always, happy reporting.